I'd like to talk about something that is rather heavy and why I think that we are headed towards a pretty big disaster that we've been headed towards blindly. We've been blind to it, but companies like 3M have not. And make a case for why I believe that transhumanism actually may be the solution. And for those of you just tuning in, I don't mean the non ethical version. If you have not followed the 3M story, I warn you, it's really hard. I find myself experiencing anxiety just reading the in depth articles about it because the blatant corruption and cover ups is undeniable. From internal documents that have been released and exposed, showing just how evil I want to say. And I don't use that word lightly, and I don't actually like using that word because I feel like it's fragmented and dualistic. And where I believe that we are going collectively is to an integrated, elevated world. But when I hear about companies like this and what they've done to our generations, it's beyond upsetting and frightening. And it makes me feel as though we need better systems in place. We cannot be relying on the validity of science and scientists, which apparently can be bought. For many of you, this is no surprise. You've known this, you've been learning this. But for others, you may be a little taken aback that when 3M realized that the forever chemicals, the PFAs and the PFOS, they had already known that it had been accumulating in humans and animals and that it was toxic. They had known it for decades. But when they started getting challenges and potential legal threats, they bought a scientist, and they did so very intentionally. And the scientist masqueraded as an independent entity, but was actually being paid and working directly with 3M to manage 3M's reputation specifically and to silence opposing viewpoints about the toxicity levels of PFAs. 3M also took off the warning labels on the chemical data sheets that tell people what to expect, making it appear as though it was a lot safer than it actually was. They knew because their animals were dying. They couldn't even finish the toxicity studies. Their rats died, their monkeys died. They had women who were pregnant, working in factories, give birth to babies that had defects. They knew this for decades and decades. And they also knew that it caused cancer. And what did they do? We're just going to take that label off. Yeah, we're going to cite some of those studies. No, we changed our minds. We're just going to, that looks bad. Yeah, that looks bad. They advertised that the chemical, which apparently is a super bonded fluorine and carbon chemical that is more stable than rocks, meaning it will outlive some of the mountains that you see. Think about that for a moment. It was so powerfully bonded that it doesn't break down. They knew that, but they advertised that it was water soluble. They actually advertised that it was biodegradable. And when they started receiving challenges about this and outcries, they buried the evidence. They marked their files as attorney-client privilege, even if attorneys weren't on the communication chains. They explicitly told their executives not to talk about things in email, just in case things would look bad when they were inquired about, and legal discovery processes. They had scientists in the 90s researching PFAs in the blood. And I believe it was 97, but don't quote me on the day or the year, rather. One scientist found that the safest level of PFAs was like 1 part per billion that could be in the blood of a human and reasonably be okay. And at that time point, it was 30 times higher in the samples that they were detecting. That was in the late 90s. Imagine where we're at today. Because 3M continued to say, no, there's no problem here. Don't worry, guys. Yeah, no. Yeah. They were raking in billions of dollars per year. And I believe it was in Minnesota that there was a lawsuit because apparently they contaminated the water supply. And it was discovered. Somebody took them to court and they won, or they settled. I can't exactly remember. And it cost them 2%, or maybe like 2.6, to be fair, percent of their annual revenue of just the PFAs alone, if I'm not mistaken. When we rely on these systems to keep people accountable who are silently cavalier about everybody's health, who actually don't care, who are so short-sighted that they demonstrate a very low sentience and consciousness level, and conscientiousness. All 3 of those are distinct. When our systems fail us, and we fast forward decades into the future, we're holding people accountable. We're holding 3M accountable. I heard lately that they're going to pay out $12 billion to water treatment plants because they have screwed up our water because there's PFAS in the water. The EPA wasn't testing these forever and only just recently started testing them and found them in our water supply. Of course, when we are relying on the EPA and other organizations to keep us safe, when we're relying on science, which can be bought, when we're relying on people to do the right thing, we're relying on failure in the face of greed. And some of the actions that 3M took were horrible. So some of those scientists in the 1990s were running these studies and were alarmed because they found PFAs in blood of obviously the people that worked at the factories in very high amounts, really, really high. But they also found it in everybody that they tested. And another scientist found it in animals, eagles, and the babies of eagles and rats in the wild, almost as though our food supply, the ecosystem, how everything circles together, was being contaminated. One of the scientists spent like her life pretty much being ridiculed for trying to raise the alarms because in the 90s when she was doing this work and she was scared because she thought that maybe there was a problem. Apparently, the executives had known it was a problem since the 70s. And there's also some literature coming out that perhaps it was even earlier than the 70s, meaning they knew the entire time. And they had scientists running studies, burying the results that they didn't like, but almost as a facade, a charade, a hand-waving gesture. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, it could be toxic. Okay, yeah. We're going to look into that. And stonewalling people in other situations where they were being confronted about their claims. My concern is that this is just one example. 3M is just one example. And these products that pervade our everyday existence that we may or may not have warning labels for, that may or may not even matter, especially when we're developing novel chemicals which interface with our genes and our hormones and all sorts of things in our bodies. And half the time, either the science is convoluted, buried, silenced, or bought. And not all the time, maybe not even half, but when it matters. And when they're big enough and their checkbook is big enough to have that much influence and domination and control. Entire marketing campaigns can take out any sort of squeak that something might be wrong until it builds and it builds and it builds. And here's the crazy thing about the 3M story is that they knew it was building this entire time. They knew that it was a forever chemical and couldn't be broken down by our bodies. They're like, well, it doesn't seem to cause any bad effects, except our toxicology studies that we're just not going to tell you about. But nobody seems to be dying in the factories yet. Never mind their children, children's children, children's children, children's children, children's children's, and the eagles, and the fish, and the birds, and the fill in the blank. Because we've been using it in our fertilizer. For what? Food. We've been putting it on our farmlands because we're fucking idiots. We have been coating our food containers with it. Yeah. Our food containers. I'm not joking. We've been making upholstery with it. Carpets and rugs, setting your children down. We've been cooking with it. We've been putting out fires with it. We haven't tested it in our food supply, really. And just recently in our water supply, and we only test like a handful of them relative to the ones that are out there. And I don't know about what you've heard, but what I've heard is that the cancer rates and the general health of the populace is declining. There are people in their 40s getting colon cancer, liver cancer, bladder cancer. It's wild. Oh, but don't worry, it's not our fault. It's probably, it's but I don't know. It's their fault. Whose fault? Somebody else's fault, but mine. I don't know. This is what I mean by truly corrupt societies are rate limited. They're self-defeating, because when you're actually corrupt and you don't take care of your progeny, like, think about it. Those executives, like, oh, I got a payday. I'm getting a nice car for Christmas, and it's so short-sighted. You're building a legacy, poisoning your family. You're literally poisoning your family. You're poisoning great minds. You're poisoning problem solvers, innovators. Your company will cease to exist because we will cease to exist. You're poisoning the fucking eagles. I mean, for God's sake. How far, if we're running a marathon race, how far do you think, when you're holding the baton, is your team going to go if you poison their water? It just seems like basic logic to me. Maybe I'm missing something. So what I come to is that we have apparently been living in a place where accountability is a joke. I'm going to leak an article about 3M in the comments so you can read it yourself. It's a great one, but it's just scratching the surface. I've read a different one that was mind-blowing, but this will give you a really good overview. And now let's imagine that DuPont is on the list. Let's imagine that others are on the list. I don't know if they are, right? But imagine for a second that parabens that we put in our lotion, which are also endocrine disrupting, they go through our skin and they affect us in negative ways. And they're a mainstay, just like PFAs, for a long time. The good news is, by the way, 3M did say that they're going to stop manufacturing by 2025, this year, of PFAs. So that is a positive. Imagine for a moment that we literally coat our bodies in similar products. We wash ourselves. We eat off of plates which are plastic or metal, or imagine that these chemicals and these coatings are ever present around us. And we silently collect these chemicals and the impacts of them without understanding what they're actually doing. And we go and we get blood tests and we check for things like cholesterol and, the usual suspects, blood sugar, and, the things that we think are killing us. But when's the last time you got a blood test for PFAs? Can you even get one if you tried? I don't know, LabCorp. What about parabens? Those are just two broad examples out of a whole suite of possibilities. So when I talk about solving problems with transhumanism, I think about problems like these when I'm communicating about how to do it well. Because what I see is that I don't want to have to rely on test manufacturers to understand what is happening in my body, especially when tests are not available for perhaps some of the most dangerous chemicals, and the ones that are not available to the public. And the science about the toxicity of them is subject to bias and corruption. I would like the use of nanotechnology, or whatever form it would take. I say nanotechnology because that's what my mind has learned in science fiction novels, but I believe that even that's probably antiquated. There needs to be some interfacing mechanism that we have circulating throughout our system that can communicate these levels of chemicals. And I want to know what my levels are. And I don't want to have to wait until I have liver cancer when I'm 45 to find out that something's wrong with my environment or my food. And I don't want to have to wait for the EPA 25 years later, late, actually 50 years late, maybe 75, actually, when you think about the entire timeline. I don't want to have to wait 75 years for them to start testing my water. "3M executives actually hand waved, figuratively speaking. Yeah, we know it's in the blood, but there doesn't seem to be any harmful effects, so that's why we didn't report it to you, EPA. Oh, okay. Thanks. Just checking in on you over there. All right, okay. You're making this new chemical? Yeah, okay. Okay, you don't see anything? Okay, all right. Sounds good. Talk to you later. We'll follow up again and never? Until there's a lawsuit? Okay, all right. I want to understand what something is doing in my body. Tonight I ate a new protein and I'd never heard of it. It's a plant-based protein, apparently from this seed of this indigenous plant from Peru. They don't really eat the fruit, but they ground up the seed and they turn it into a protein that is non-soy based, and it's called a chi protein. And it's kind of nutty. It really kind of tastes like a variation of a peanut. Knowing what I know about a 3M and these products, not that I have any reason to worry about my food, I was still captivated with this curiosity of what is it doing inside of me. I mean, I know it's protein, but what other vitamins does it have? How is it impacting my metabolism, my cellular respiration, for those biomedical geeks out there? Like, how is it impacting my ATP synthesis? And that's what I believe sovereignty is. I touched on this on an episode recently where I asked, kind of in a snarky way, like, what is sovereignty really? Is it that we can just shop at whatever store we want to and free to travel on an old-fashioned airplane? And this guy go to some country with a visa. Is that sovereignty really? Or is it understanding exactly what machinery we are embedded into? It's like driving a car, except you're the car. Somebody's putting gas in you. They're saying, don't worry. I know you prefer premium, but I'm going to give you corn oil instead. Oh, it's good for you. Don't worry. It's better for you even. Grin with big teeth shining. So when you're a car and you're driving, there are so many components that are working in this beautiful symphony. But when you're from the perspective of the car, you don't know how everything is fitting together. And we have doctors that tell us how everything is fitting together, but we don't really understand what it's like to be a sensor in the car. And that sensor in the car is giving feedback to a mechanism that a mechanic can run diagnostics on. I would like us to be able to have sensor level readings at our fingertips so we can understand when we try a new product or a new lotion, just to call back that example, or the clothes that are swimming in PFAs that we put up against our most nether regions and give our children. I would like to understand the impact that it's having, not only at the cellular level, but at the genetic level. And that's what I believe the power of transhumanism is, personally, because that feels like sovereignty to me.